A woman lies dead in her bed from a drug overdose. The family photo on her dresser shows that she was a single mother of 2 daughters. Her youngest daughter, Rose, standing at the door, looking devastated. Several years later in the future, Rose is now an adult working as a psychiatrist at a mental hospital. That day, she heads into a session with Carl, one of the hospital's long-term patients. Carl is having a manic episode, repeatedly saying that he is going to die. Rose calmly tries to comfort him, but Carl continues his episode. Rose is deeply committed to helping her patients, so much so that she hasn't been home since her late shift the night before. Just as she's about to leave for the day, she gets a call about a new patient, Laura, who urgently needs assistance. According to Laura's file, she's been mentally unstable since witnessing her university professor kill himself with a hammer last week. Rose agrees to meet her. When Laura arrives, she looks highly distressed, but Rose gently convinces her to sit down. Laura insists that she's not crazy, but is being chased by an entity no one else can see. This entity can disguise itself as different people, sometimes people she knows, other times complete strangers. The one thing that stands out is the way it smiles, a wide, unsettling grin that is far from friendly. To make things worse, Laura says the entity told her she's going to die today. Hearing this, Rose believes Laura is hallucinating and explains that, after traumatic events, the mind can make us see things that aren't real. But Laura grows more frustrated with Rose's response. Suddenly, Laura starts screaming, dragging herself to the edge of the room, all the while shouting that the entity is in the room with them. Alarmed, Rose grabs the phone to call for help, but when she turns back, Laura is standing right in front of her, smiling wickedly, holding a sharp piece from a broken vase. In an instant, Laura slashes her own throat while Rose stands frozen, unable to react. The hospital emergency team rushes in, but it's too late. Later, 2 detectives arrive to question Rose about what happened. One of the detectives is Joel, Rose's ex-boyfriend. Shaken, Rose explains that Laura was delusional and describes how she was smiling as she killed herself. After the horrifying event at work, Rose finally goes home. That evening, Rose drinks some wine to calm herself. Suddenly, she notices something chilling. Laura is standing in the corner of the room, smiling at her. Just then, Rose's fiancé, Trevor, comes home from work, interrupting her. When Rose tells him about her day, she looks back and sees that Laura is no longer there, dismissing the eerie vision as just another hallucination. That night, Rose and her fiancé go out to dinner with her snobby sister, Holly, and Holly's husband, Greg. Rose is clearly still shaken by Laura's suicide and hardly pays attention to what they're saying. She becomes defensive when Holly and Greg casually suggest selling their childhood home for some extra cash. After dinner, Rose ends the evening by feeding her fluffy cat Moustache. The next day, even though Rose feels upset, she forces herself to go back to work. Out of curiosity, she heads to the front desk and asks for the case report of the professor who died in front of Laura. Just as she does this, her ex-boyfriend Joel suddenly shows up to check on her after the traumatic incident. Rose insists that she's fine and tells him to leave before she retreats to her office to study the case report. The professor's name was Gabriel Munoz. A little later, Holly calls to apologize for their argument and invites Rose to her son's upcoming birthday party. While they chat, Rose notices someone outside the hospital who looks just like Laura. Despite feeling uneasy, she brushes it off and goes about her day. But things take a turn when she walks by Carl's room and sees him smiling eerily, just like Laura did. Worried, she checks on him, but Carl suddenly grins widely and starts saying that Rose is going to die. Terrified, Rose calls for the nurses as Carl stands up, shouting the same words. Yet when the nurses arrive, they find Carl lying calmly in bed, as if nothing had happened. This strange event makes Rose's boss summon her to his office. He's concerned because Carl has been a long-term patient and has never acted violently before. He suspects Rose may be misinterpreting things due to the trauma from Laura's suicide. He gives her a week off to recover. Later that night, while Rose is home alone, the house alarm suddenly goes off. Scared, she grabs a pair of scissors and heads for the front door, but it's still locked. However, the back door is wide open. Then, she gets a phone call from a security operator checking if she's okay. Strangely, the caller tells her to look behind her, which leaves Rose confused. Even stranger, the phone rings again, and she realizes she's not holding the phone at all. Startled, she answers another call, this time from an actual security operator. The police arrive and check the house but find nothing unusual. Rose's fiancé Trevor comes home just as the officers leave. Though concerned about her, Rose assures him that she's fine. Still, she's more anxious than ever. especially since she can't seem to find her cat, Mustache. That night, Rose can't sleep, so she listens to the recording of her session with Laura. As she listens to Laura's screams, she hears a faint whisper in the background. Curious, she turns up the volume and is shocked to hear her own name being whispered. Terrified, Rose grabs a knife, but the mysterious figure she thought she saw has vanished. Trevor rushes in, alarmed by Rose's behavior, but she reassures him even though she's beginning to doubt her own sanity. Fearing she might be losing her mind, Rose goes to see her therapist, Madeline. After assessing her, Madeline assures Rose that she isn't delusional. Instead, she's likely reliving the trauma of her childhood, when she witnessed her mother die from a drug overdose. Trying to move forward, Rose decides to attend her niece's birthday party. A few hours into the birthday party, it's time for the gift unwrapping. When Rose's gift is opened, the kids are horrified to find not a toy train, but the lifeless body of her cat, Mustache, inside the box. Rose bursts into tears, holding her dead cat, desperately trying to convince everyone that she didn't do this. In the middle of the chaos, she notices one of the guests has the same eerie smile as the entity, though no one else sees it. Terrified, Rose stumbles backward and crashes into a glass table, injuring herself. She's rushed to the emergency room for treatment and later driven home by Trevor. Once they get home, Rose tries to explain to him that she's being followed by some kind of entity, but Trevor doesn't believe her. He suggests that Rose might be mentally ill, just like her mother was. That night, Rose continues her research on Laura's professor, Gabriel Munoz, until she suddenly hears her mother's voice calling her name. Frightened, she forces herself to sleep, even though the entity, now taking the form of her mother, watches her from the shadows. The next day, Rose pretends to be a reporter and visits Gabriel Munoz's wife to ask about his death. Mrs. Munoz shows Rose a collection of disturbing drawings Gabriel made shortly before he died, all of them showing faces with unsettling wide smiles. Mrs. Munoz also explains that Gabriel started acting strange after witnessing a woman commit suicide. Rose confides that she's going through the same thing as Gabriel, but Mrs. Munoz thinks she's mocking her husband's death and angrily throws her out of the house. Desperate for help, Rose turns to her ex-boyfriend, Joel. She begs him to look up the woman who killed herself in front of Gabriel in the police database. After finding the woman's name, Rose has a theory and asks Joel to check if this woman also witnessed someone die. As it turns out, she did. Together, they watch a security video showing a man approach the woman and kill himself with head shears. Just like Laura, the man had a twisted smile on his face before he died. Rose prints out all the evidence, planning to show it to Trevor. But when she gets home, she's shocked to find that he's invited her therapist over, convinced that Rose is mentally unwell. Furious, Rose yells at Trevor, accusing him of caring more about how her condition will affect him than actually believing her. She storms out, leaving him behind. Feeling betrayed by Trevor, Rose turns to her sister, Holly, for help. But Holly doesn't believe her either. Instead, Holly says that Rose is starting to sound like their mum, which leads to a heated argument. They begin to talk about their painful childhood, where Holly moved away and left young Rose alone with their abusive mother. The argument ends when Holly coldly walks back into the house, leaving Rose feeling defeated as she heads back to her car. Just when Rose thinks there might be some hope, Holly comes back outside and walks toward the car. But it's not really Holly. It's the entity, playing tricks again. Later that night, Rose gets a call from Joel, her ex-boyfriend. He's found a disturbing pattern linking 20 different suicides, with 19 of them connected by people who witnessed the previous deaths. At some point, a man named Robert Talley witnessed a suicide and then killed someone else. Robert is still alive today, and Joel discovers that the person who saw Robert's murder committed suicide a week later, continuing the chain. Joel agrees to take Rose to see Robert Talley in prison. On the way, Rose explains everything that's been happening to her. Unlike everyone else, Joel believes her. He also warns her that none of the past victims survived more than a week, which terrifies Rose since it's already her 4th day. When Rose meets Robert, she asks him how he survived. Robert tells her that the only way to break the curse is by killing someone in front of another witness. This way, the curse is passed on to the person who sees the murder. Horrified by the idea of killing someone, Rose tells him she can't do it. Robert panics, thinking that Rose brought the entity with her, and he has to be restrained. As Joel drives her home, Rose thinks about what Robert said and tries to come up with another solution. She studies the case files but can't find any other way out. Then, her therapist unexpectedly shows up at her door, concerned about Rose's mental health. Rose lets her in, but just as they're about to talk, the phone rings. To Rose's shock, it's her therapist on the phone, saying she's worried about Rose. This means the person sitting in front of her isn't the real therapist, it's the entity in disguise. The entity reveals itself by smiling wickedly and warning Rose that her time is running out. As the entity steps closer to her and then disappears, desperate, Rose decides to take matters into her own hands. She hides a knife in her sleeve and heads to the mental hospital, going straight to Carl's room. Carl is terrified when she enters, and he starts screaming. Rose's boss rushes in, confused and asking what's going on. Without hesitation, Rose pulls out the knife and repeatedly stabs Carl. But something strange happens. Carl begins to smile as she stabs him. Then, Rose's boss tears his own face off, revealing that it was all just another hallucination. Rose screams in frustration, only for her real boss to appear, asking her what she's doing. He tries to convince her to come inside and talk, but Rose insists she needs to be alone. As soon as she says that, she sees a vision of a bloody Carl, sending her into a panic as she drives away. Rose realizes that the entity's goal is to force her to kill herself in front of someone else, passing the curse on. To stop this, she decides to isolate herself completely. She drives to her childhood home, and on the way, Joel calls her, worried because her boss has alerted the police that she might be a danger to herself. Rose assures Joel that isolating herself is the only way to break the curse, and asks him not to follow her. For the first time in years, Rose returns to the place where she faced so much trauma. As she walks toward her mother's old bedroom, she remembers the day her mother died from a drug overdose, begging young Rose to call 911. But Rose, scared of her abusive mother, didn't help. Now, back in the present, Rose shuts all the windows and doors, preparing to face the entity. As night falls, she hears her mother crying from the bedroom, but this time, Rose isn't afraid. She walks into the room and finds her mother sobbing. Rose confronts the vision, saying she no longer feels guilty for letting her mother die because her mother was a monster who hurt her. She tells herself to forgive and no longer let the trauma haunt her. The entity, disguised as her mother, starts smiling. Rose tries to leave, but the entity blocks her path, transforming into a tall, distorted version of her mother. Rose backs up into the living room, but the entity suddenly appears behind her and throws her across the room. The creature pins her down, but Rose realizes that it only has power if she's afraid. Since the entity is in her mind, she takes control. Rose breaks its arm and smashes the lantern on it, setting the creature on fire. She watches the house burn down and leaves, returning to the city in the morning. Rose goes to Joel's apartment and apologizes for pushing him away due to her unresolved childhood trauma. She asks if she can stay and rest, but then Joel smiles eerily and says she can stay with him forever. Horrified, Rose realizes this isn't the real Joel. She runs out of the apartment, but the entity chases her, pulling her back to her childhood home. At the same time, the real Joel arrives at her location, trying to get inside because he's worried about her. Fearing for Joel's safety, Rose locks herself in the house. Inside, the entity crawls out, ripping off its skin, and begins to take full control of Rose. It forces itself into her body in a disturbing manner. When Joel finally breaks into the house, he finds Rose covered in lamp oil. But it's too late. Rose turns to him with a sinister smile. In the film's final moments, she lights a match and sets herself on fire, while Joel watches in shock and horror. And that's how the twisted story ends with a twist. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our stories.